Nothing contained in this podcast should be considered a substitute for professional medical advice. This content does not represent our respective employers and is purely the opinion of the podcast hosts. We are not your personal medical providers. Sorry, friends. So, if you have concerns or are seeking a diagnosis or treatment, please seek individual advice from a healthcare provider in your area. We are not liable for any risks associated with acting upon the information contained in this podcast. This is intended for educational and entertainment purposes only, so enjoy the ride.
Please drink responsibly and in moderation. Before drinking, please be sure to be of the legal drinking age for your country. We do not encourage the misuse of alcohol.
Welcome to Medical Media Mixer, the perfect cocktail. I'm Nicole Peniston, psychologist.
And I'm Tara Prisco, physician assistant. All right.
I forgot to tell you, I was having a therapy session with one of my clients who did not realize that I have a podcast with you. And she randomly said the perfect cocktail. And I was like, what? And she's like, what do you mean? And I'm like, that's the tagline of my podcast. She's like, you have a podcast? So
we still need merch that says something like we're all trying to be the perfect
yeah, we need to go back
or something like that.
Yeah. Need to find whatever we said in that episode because it was pretty good.
We say magic things and then forget them. Although
that could be another shirt. We say magic things and then forget them.
I still, when I was editing the Trinity of Chris's, I'm dying. The holy trifecta of Chris.
Goodness.
Oh my goodness. See, we crack ourselves up. That's why we thought we would be cool for this.
I told you, sometimes I listen and I'm like, I am funny. And I do not pat myself on the back for many things. So I'm going to take the win on that one.
Go for it. You deserve it. You definitely have that quick wit, you know?
I try. I feel like sometimes it's so dry that I don't know if you always get it. I just slip it in and then you're just like, I'm reading my notes.
No, I get it. And it just makes a little sprinkling of flavor on our episodes.
Yeah, sprinkle some sauce on there.
The Nicole sauce.
That doesn't sound good. Let's not try that one.
Is it spicy?
I'm spicy.
I am definitely not spicy.
Oh, please. You can be. I've seen a little spice.
I can be, but I would say if someone met me, they'd be like, I don't know. I'm the straight man in this group here.
Somebody's got to be, so.
My goodness. So, do you have any fun plans for the next few days? Weekend coming up, which is 4.5
It's only
days
Tuesday,
today.
so the weekend is not here soon enough.
It is not.
Fun plans for this weekend? I don't think so, but next weekend, or is it the weekend after next? I have to consult my calendar. Hold, please. Yes, next weekend, Deb and I are going to the Edgar Allan Poe Speakeasy.
I saw that, and then you were away, and then I never did it.
It comes around again. So I'm going to go with Deb. They request that you come dressed for the occasion. So I've got some Gothic Victorian attire that I will hope to wear.
There was another thing that I was trying to get the husband to do with me. It was a Mead old-timey fantasy improv thing. It was similar, a pop-up-y type thing that happens. And we just never put a date on the books. I have to see if it's still happening, because if it is, maybe I'll try and squeeze it in before the end of the summer.
Yeah.
Because it was it just sounded fun. Nowadays, with the internet, there's just random things that pop up and you're like, yeah, that so many fun interesting. Things. Ooh, yes. That sounds interesting.
Yes, well, supposedly I will find out by Thursday if my panel got accepted for Comic-Con.
For Comic-Con.
So, fingers crossed. I don't have much hope since it's 2 days away. I feel like they would have told me by now, but we'll see what happens.
You never know.
I know, never say never.
Yeah. All right. So what's interesting is my topic today kind of piggybacks a little bit off of yours. Somewhat. Okay. Time period wise, it's a little earlier, but it sort of goes into how we talked about in the last episode, how psychology was developing at that time. So, what I'm doing isn't purely psychology, but there's definitely a huge part of that. So my cocktail is the Army Navy. Army and the Navy? Army Navy. I don't remember how exactly it was worded.
I think it said Army Navy. I remember typing it in for the socials.
Army Ampersand Navy, apparently.
Ampersand. That's what I'm going to name my firstborn. Ampersand. Ampy.
Actually, the nickname isn't bad,
It's not.
So this is 2 ounces of gin. They say preferably London dry. I'm not a gin connoisseur, but what I use is pretty good. An ounce of freshly squeezed lemon juice, 3/4 ounce of orgeat. I don't know exactly how to pronounce it, but I bought it and it was really good. So it's a type of syrup that has like almond, sugar, and like a rose or orange flower water taste to it. And it actually gives a really cool nuance to the flavor of the cocktail. So it's actually worth it. I lost my cocktail. Let's get back to where I was.
Lost her cocktail. Put out a
and then
missing cocktail.
2 dashes the Angostura bitters. And you put that all in a shaker over ice, shake and strain into either a martini or a coupe glass. Seems like everything's themed on the coupe glass now. That's just where we are in time, right? It's actually pretty good. That orgeat stuff, whatever it is, does give like a really nice like juxtaposition to the other flavors. And I kind of feel like of the cocktails we've done, this is one that I could definitely like pull out anytime because I have this giant bottle of this orgeat stuff. But yeah, I could do it anytime. It was really nice. And so the Army and the Navy, this is definitely a nod to the military. I'm covering the women, the book by Kristin Hannah. So have you read any Kristin Hannah books? Like The Nightingale, and there's a bunch of them. There's like
I feel like I have, but I don't know which one.
Okay. There are a lot of historical fiction.
Yeah.
I really was one of those people who are like, oh, that's too popular. I'm not going to read it. Oh, that's too popular. I'm not going to read it. I don't know why. I get turned off and then eventually I come around.
Same.
So I did eventually read it and I used the Libby app and I'm borrowing from my local library digitally, which is really cool. Libby, you want to plug us? Go for it.
Yeah. Sponsor us. We'll read all the books.
So it's really neat. So I was able to borrow from my library and read it on my Kindle. So the Women is essentially the tale, and it's a fictional tale, but the author did research interviewing people of this time who went through similar circumstances. So it follows a young woman, Frances, called Frankie by her friends and family, who grew up in a very entitled, rich, not entitled, she's not particularly entitled in her personality, but a very wealthy to-do family in California, lived right on the beach. Her family is very well-to-do. And her father always had this thing about heroes, about people who had military service. And everybody in his family had been in military service except for himself because he had flat feet or something that disqualified him. And he even in his office had a wall of pictures of all the family in there, anyone in their family tree, basically, that had been in the military and served. And so her brother, who's a few years older than her, not by much, had gone to the Naval Academy, and this was during the time of Vietnam, and so he ended up going to Vietnam as an officer. And they're thinking, oh, he's an officer, he's not going to see any real, battle, nothing's going to happen. They have this big, huge, going away party for him. And pretty quickly, they eventually received that notification that her brother had passed away in the war, had been killed in duty. So, she had been always expected to get married, have children. She did go to college and got a nursing degree, but that was really meant to tide her over until she got married. That was really what her parents expected. And of the time, I understand that.
Everybody went and got their MRS degree.
Exactly. So she had very, very little experience nursing, just a little bit in a community hospital, not much. But because of this tragedy, and because she always felt that her father didn't really respect her because she couldn't be the big military hero, she decided to try and sign up to be a nurse in Vietnam in the military. And so she went to each branch of the military, the Marines, the Air Force, the Navy, and finally the Army is the only one that would accept her little amount of experience that she had. So she went through all of the typical basic training and shipped out. Of course, her family was upset. Of course, it caused a lot of uproar. But really what we're talking about is her experience there and her experience after, not so much the personal things that goes on. Of course, there's love and loss and, all of these other things. Read the book. I'm not going to give you any major spoilers.
Not fair.
Because it is actually a really, really well done book. So the big thing is, she gets dropped basically in the middle of, okay, like this is how we do it here. There's a helicopter coming in to trauma. Everybody's got to shape up. Everyone's got to do this. You take this patient, you do this. There's people with legs blown off, people with head trauma, people with burns on 90% of their bodies coming in. And she essentially just gets thrown into having to pick that up with her little to no experience. It's interesting because I've always known that military nursing, and of course, like we talk like Florence Nightingale, the big, like that known military nursing being an important role. But I think in Vietnam, their role really was both very significant because they did more than a typical nurse stateside would do, but also very, very under-recognized because when she comes back, of course, after all of this that she's seen and all of these traumas she's participated in and all of these men who she's held their hand while they died and she just talked to them because she knew they couldn't make it. And when she came back, of course, we remember the stories about people coming back from Vietnam and the anti-war. And I understand people not wanting war, but they were unkind to these veterans, essentially, these people returning from war. And everybody told her, there were no women in Vietnam. What are you talking about? She went to the VA. There were no women in Vietnam. She went to, anyone to try and get help. There were no, what are you talking about? So her experience was so unique. This character, but this embodies the actual real experience of many, many, nurses and military people, but specifically women.
And I'm sure that happened in wars prior to that too, because I don't feel like it was probably maybe not even until like the Gulf War where women were now recognized as, oh yes, they're soldiers, they're doing things.
Exactly. Yeah, I really don't think they were active participants or really recognized in that way. But this was just the way the story was told, the relationships, the bonding that they had, anybody who went through this and her friends that she developed, these other nurses, the bond that they had together. But it also becomes the evolution of PTSD as a diagnosis, right? The Vietnam War was a stepping point because of the type of war it was. It was, of course, all the other wars, they had it. But because this was that tight jungle, you didn't know what was going to happen, guerrilla warfare.
Right. I think that was where like the term PTSD started to come, because prior to that, it was more like shell shock or things like that they assumed was shorter term and there would be recovery from.
Exactly. So I just wanted to talk first a little bit about just the women who did serve there and their roles. So about 11,000 military women served in Vietnam, and about 90% of them were nurses. And of course, like I just said, when they came home, many were told they hadn't really been to war. They were ignored in the parades. They were excluded from veterans' benefits, dismissed when they tried to talk about their PTSD. And, there's several real nurses who, were interviewed later on and stated that they were erased from the national narrative, even though they were working under absolutely bloody, terrifying conditions. You're at these little tent hospitals. You could be bombed. Anything could happen to you too, right? Mm-hmm. And, these experiences are really beautifully shown in this. So women's role in wartime nursing really dates back to the Civil War, at least on American terms. I'm not going to go into every other country. Obviously, it's very complex. During the Civil War, about 6,000 women served as nurses, many of them volunteers. We've heard of Clara Barton, who I believe is from New Jersey. I think we have a rest area named after her, I think.
Sounds about right.
And Dorothy
Or was
Dix.
she one of the ones they changed to, like,
oh, I think
Queen
she
Latifah
was. Yes.
or John Bon Jovi?
Yes, I think that she used to have one.
I don't think she does anymore.
And Dorothea Dix. And they faced intense resistance, but they were really shown to be indispensable during their respective times in the Civil War. And then in World War I and World War II, women were finally given official roles in the Army and Navy, Nurse Corps. So they had an actual official organization. And by World War II, over 59,000 women served as nurses overseas. But again, despite that, they were not given the status, the pay, or the benefits that the men were given. And then this goes back to another media piece, MASH, which we all remember.
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't know if we all remember, but people of our age remember.
By the time of Vietnam, women were embedded in these mobile units, these tent hospitals, these MASH units, and they were for mass casualties and things like that would be helicoptered in. So there were helicopter landing zones and essentially field hospitals, and they were under fire at times as well. They often treated young men with, like I mentioned, catastrophic injuries. And so they literally had to make decisions like, this is, I can't remember the term they use, but basically this is one that we can't help.
Mm-hmm.
And then this is one, okay, we're going to take them back and work on them. And part of this character in the book, Frankie, part of her very initial, when she was very green and didn't know anything, she would be the one who would sit with the ones who aren't going to make it and hold their hand and just comfort them and tell them, you know, I'm going to tell me your mother's name or your sweetheart's name and I'll write them a letter type of a thing. So they took on not just the physical helping of patients, but that sort of emotional trauma that they were trying to help these gentlemen, you know, pass through, you know. But like we're saying, Vietnam had no clear front lines. It's not like we're in a war where our tanks are just moving in one direction and we're all trying to gain ground. There were things that were coming from every direction. So no matter what, they were in danger at all times, which is very different than other wars. And they would work 12-hour shifts, you know, treating these burns. So they not only treated the soldiers, but they also treated villagers. Because if you remember, napalm was used to basically, they needed to burn large areas of jungle for better visibility from the air. But of course, some of these villagers would get caught up in that and they would come in and be burned significant parts of their body. Because of the type of war, a lot of amputations, a lot of shrapnel wounds. You know, anytime they heard that helicopter coming, it was like, what do I expect now? Like, what do I know? And they had to really continue to be calm, you know, and feminine and emotionally detached and just sort of do their job. What's interesting is the average infantryman served 240 days in combat, and the nurses were there along those same periods of time, like just as many days as some of the men were there. They said over 500,000 helicopter missions evacuated wounded soldiers. And where did they end up? These little tent hospitals.
Yeah.
But medically, this is also a turning point for military medicine because the survival rates did go up in Vietnam compared to other wars. Because they had these trained nurses, because they had these trauma surgeons and these trained men also who are the physicians coming in. So the battlefield case fatalities dropped to 15.8% in Vietnam, where it was over 30% in World War II. Due to this skilled nature and these nurses having such an integral role in assisting. So in modern medicine, in a hospital that you may go to, the physician, the PA, the NP writes the orders and the nurse carries them out, right? But here they were making decisions and having to do things because the doctor was working on somebody else's brain or whatever body part was blown off. They were suturing. They were doing more hands-on things than we typically would think of as a nurse. So, you know, it definitely had that.
Well, and you kind of already alluded to this, but they were probably just outnumbered that like a nurse had to act as a doctor because there's just so many patients.
Exactly.
You can't waste time going back and forth or waiting for someone else. You just have to do what you can.
Exactly. So they really did learn to just jump in hands-on. Obviously, day one, that didn't happen. You got relegated to a quieter ward in the beginning, but then you eventually worked your way down to that trauma. And it really was all about the difference between Vietnam and the other wars was the type of injuries, the speed that the patients arrived. So helicopters like the Huey evacuated soldiers within minutes of being wounded, so alive but critically injured, and got them to these little tent hospitals. So the nurses were actively right there in those trauma settings as they came off those helicopters. So the type of weapons also were a bit different. So M16s, AK-47s, cause
using more machine guns than in other wars.
Right. Yeah. More tissue destruction, blast injuries, so amputations from those grenades and landmines and booby traps, right? Because this is that type of warfare.
I'm having that scene from Forrest Gump when Forrest is like in the middle of the jungle and then the bomb hits and you see him like running out.
Yes.
And then he goes back and gets, he tries to get Bubba and he loses Bubba. And then he goes back and gets Lieutenant Dan.
Lieutenant Dan.
What happened to your legs, Lieutenant Dan? You got new legs. I love that movie so much.
It is. That is such a heartwarming movie. There are so many movies made about that time period. So like we do get little glimpses, but I think, different roles, like obviously the soldier's role has been shown a lot of times, but maybe this other role hadn't been.
Yeah.
I'd say the closest thing to it was the movie and TV show MASH, of showing those nurses right there doing things.
But even that was a lot of focus on the male doctors, the male characters. We did see female characters and trans characters, but
yes, good old MASH. That used to be one of those things that you just turn on and it was just on always.
It was always on. I can still hear the theme song.
Yes.
I never really liked the show, but it was just always there.
I liked it. I mean, it was definitely, the jokes probably flew over my head as a child. Like there were certain things that I probably didn't get. But I think it did do more justice, at least, than some other depictions. But like we said, these burns from that napalm, the penetrating chest wounds, brain trauma, abdominal eviscerations, and often these men would just come in actively dying and screaming. Unlike World War II, the nurses who worked in these hospitals that were far behind the lines, the Vietnam nurses worked right there in the middle of all of it. So there was no time for them to process anything. They were in danger just as much as these soldiers that were coming in. And often, just like this character in this book, they were 21, 22 years old. They were babies themselves. I mean, and as were the soldiers who were 18.
Yeah.
Our parents' generation was very much in the middle of that. So my mother graduated high school in 1969. So all of her peers essentially went to Vietnam. My father actually served in the Coast Guard. So I guess that got him out of going because he was in another branch. But all of their contemporaries did this. So this is very much of that time period. And I think back home, there was a big disconnect because we don't have the type of news and things that we have now, that people back home at first didn't understand really what was going on overseas. And then once they did, there was that anti-war sentiment. And so, of course, we don't want our young people dying in war that we don't think is solving anything. I understand that. But then those people who've just survived all of this coming back and being treated like garbage, spit on, like cursed at, yelled at. It's sad. It's scary. I don't know where that turn came, that they were the bad guys.
It was highly politically motivated, I'm sure.
I'm sure. Yeah.
Many of those social shifts are.
Yeah. So
I'm just trying to think, like the last episode I talked about how that story I'd heard in that class about trauma and dissociation. We also read a book about World War I and trauma and how that really started people thinking about it. So I was looking it up. It's called Regeneration by Pat Barker. And that's also a really good book about how at the end of World War I, they were just beginning to realize that there's something more to this shell shock, but they really didn't get there until, like you said, like Vietnam, World War II, Vietnam.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, this is like we talked about PTSD, so post-traumatic stress disorder. Mm-hmm. It was not an official diagnosis till 1980, but it stems from, I think this is a large study group, is all of these people who came back from Vietnam. And like you said, shell shock, combat fatigue, or just you're weak, essentially.
Yeah.
But it took the activism of the Vietnam veterans themselves for it to be taken seriously. I don't think anybody else from the outside was necessarily looking at it that way. And they do demonstrate that, where they had to seek out their own help and they had to come themselves and protest to get the help they needed. And so it kind of like talks a little bit about like a moral injury, a deep sense of guilt, like betrayal from participating and witnessing something that is bad, but like you weren't there. You were just there doing what you needed to do because your country told you to, right? It was a very difficult time, but it can cause just that dissonance right there can cause depression, isolation, just not necessarily just the trauma, but that did I do something wrong because I was an active participant in this war? And so these women veterans definitely suffered in silence and really did not get the support from the VA and the public. So it's interesting. I think this book, I highly recommend it. It was on all those lists as the best books. Read it. It definitely enthralled me. I think it's fairly long. I don't remember how many exact pages it was, but it kept me enthralled the entire time. I was invested in the characters. I learned a lot about the time period for sure.
Wasn't it like book of the year last year? I know Kristin has had multiple books of the year.
Yeah, it was a last year book, I believe was its big time.
Yeah.
And so they even interviewed some Vietnam nurses after the fact and said that the book made them feel seen for the first time, that they actually really identified with it. And, it helps a new generation sort of understand that. I think we hopefully do a much better job now as people go in and come out of the military and out of active duty and military. But it's interesting that it took, just like your last story, it took the trauma to learn from it. And I just think that, I think sometimes take for granted that role too of nurses. Nurses have always been in this assisting role, but they're really there on the human level. They're really there on the day to day. So as a provider, always kind of look back and thank your nurses, because they're there when you're not. They're your eyes and ears when they're calling you from the office with what's going on with a patient. They're the ones who are there often when a patient is in any circumstance, the one passing away, because there's how many hours in a day? There's always a nurse there, but there's not always a provider there. They play such an integral role in our healthcare system, and of course in the history of military healthcare. I think nurses have always been a big part of that, and I'm sure their role even now is even more in tuned. And we will get into later on in other episodes where medics come in and other roles come in. But I just think it was, as I was reading it, I wasn't reading it with the intention of doing anything podcast related. I was reading it for just myself. And once I read about it, I was like, we need to talk about these women who really, really made a difference. And even anyone who held a man's hand while he was dying, you made a difference, right?
Yeah.
And then, of course, just all of those veterans being the pioneers of where we learned about PTSD, and now we can address it. It is a real diagnosis, and we have ways to hopefully treat it. And I know you've done a lot of veteran trainings and things like that.
Yeah, I've done a lot of trainings with the VA for all different sorts of things. Both my undergraduate and my graduate theses and dissertation were on trauma in different settings. So there's still a lot of work to be done with trauma, and I hope we can, learn from things like COVID, but also from war nursing about how to better support our nurses who receive trauma from working in these traumatic situations, because they need support too.
Yeah. I mean, we've touched on the healthcare and violence. We've touched on the not being appreciated in your work, place and COVID. As healthcare people, we have feelings too. But those nurses are the ones like right there on the front line. And then, something that eventually we'll have to cover as an offshoot of this is Agent Orange. And that's something that did not immediately affect people's health.
And we talked about a little in our, fictional disorders episode, or supposed fictional disorders episode?
Yes.
Yeah.
So now we see some of the outcomes of these gentlemen who are in their 70s and what that exposure has done to them. So I think that we'll have to cover separately, because there's a whole lot more on that. But I think, it's not something in medicine I've learned about military exposures and things like that, but it's something that we need to know, because these people often see the VA, but they also see a primary and a cardiologist and a gastroenterologist and other people on the outside, right? They get like their extra, they may get their meds for free, and they may get some extra tests done because the VA covers it, but we still kind of need to learn that. And it's not something we're particularly taught. So to understand that, because I'm sure each individual war zone has had different things that come out of it, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And especially like you're saying, like with Agent Orange, how with advances in science, there is more chemical warfare, other things that we don't know, how that is going to impact trauma and impact people in the long run. So just making sure that we're aware that this is something that happens to people, even if it's not our preferred population to work with, being aware that it's something that does impact people that could come in our offices, and we know how to treat it and know how to find the information that we need.
Yeah. I really really want to meet like a military nurse, so I can the respect of I like to get to know the people's backgrounds and things. It hasn't come up thus far. I've definitely met some Vietnam veterans, but not specifically nurses, but just that experience and what they've been through and where they are in life now and what they've learned from it. I think there's a lot to learn from them. So that's what I got for you.
Yeah.
It was, like I said, it's a great book. Read it. It's not your quick beach read, but it's enthralling. It is an enthralling read. So,
and if you like that, I think you'll like that book I mentioned before, Regeneration by Pat Barker. It's actually the first in a trilogy, and they're all about the beginning to the end of World War I and how people were just coming to realize the mental health aspect of being a soldier, being injured. And at that time, unfortunately, the focus of this book and the trilogy is to get these folks back into battle when maybe that wasn't the best choice for them. So I think we've learned from that as well over time, when someone needs to be honorably discharged for their service, or when someone needs more mental health care, when the same goes for our military doctors and nurses. When is too much? When is it too much for them? And when can we allow them to leave that post with respect instead of feeling like they failed the system. Because I think there's a lot of that loyalty and expectation in the military to stay until the bitter end. And that's not sustainable, especially in the types of things that we're talking about.
No. Yeah. So here's to our military medical providers and soldiers.
Yes.
And
thank you all for your service.
Yeah, we really respect everything you've done for our country. And, like I said, we want to hopefully continue to support you. So
yes.
That's the episode.
Send us an email. Tell us about your experience. We would love to hear from you so we can learn just for our own professional knowledge, not even for the podcast, just so we can develop and be better for our folks.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you for listening to Medical Media Mixer.
The perfect cocktail. Cheers.
Cheers. My drink is empty. Yours is not.
A little bit slush at the bottom. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of the Medical Media Mixer podcast. If you enjoyed the conversation, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review us on your favorite podcast platform. Your support helps others find the show. Want to keep the conversation going? Follow us on social media. We're at Medical Media Mixer Podcast on Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, YouTube, and on Pinterest, the Medical Media Mixer board.
If you'd like to support the show and help us grow, check us out on Patreon. Patreon.com/Medical Media Mixer Podcast. And on Buy Me a Coffee, buymeacoffee.com/Medical Media Mixer Podcast. If you have a topic idea, feedback, or just want to say hi, send us an email at medicalmediamixer@gmail.com. You can also stream all of our episodes and find more info on our website, medicalmediamixer.podbean.com. We're available on all major podcast platforms, so no matter where you listen, we're there. Thanks again for listening, and until next time, keep mixing medicine and media.